Annabeth arrived in the town of Redemption Creek with nothing but the dust on her boots and a silence in her heart that was heavier than the worn satchel on her shoulder. She was 18. The day her father pointed to the road, his face a mask of grim duty, the world had shrunk to the space she occupied and the ground immediately beneath her feet. She did not look back. The town itself was a collection of sharp angles and straight lines, a testament to mankind's desire to impose order on a landscape that knew only curves and wind. Wooden storefronts with false fronts stared down at her like disapproving elders. Faces peered from behind thin panes of warped material in doorways, their gazes quick and assessing, dismissing her before she had even taken a dozen steps down the main thoroughfare. There was a livery, a general store, a sheriff's office, and a saloon whose music seemed thin and weary in the vast emptiness of the plains. She felt the weight of their collective judgment, a physical pressure that sought to turn her around, to send her back to whatever shame she had come from. But there was nowhere to go back to. She walked through the town without stopping, her stride even and deliberate, her eyes fixed on a point beyond the last building, where the prairie resumed its reign. There, on a gentle rise overlooking the creek that gave the town its name, stood a ghost. It was a colossal grain silo, abandoned years ago when the railroad spur had been rerouted. Its metal skin was rusted to the color of dried blood, its conical roof a dark hat against the pale, unforgiving sky. To the people of Redemption Creek, it was an eyesore, a monument to failed ambition. To Annabeth, it was a promise. It was the only round thing in a world of rigid squares. It was the shape of safety, the form of survival. Her grandfather's voice was a low murmur in her memory, a current of wisdom from a man the world had called mad but who had understood the secrets of the wind and the cold. He had taught her that a circle has no weakness for the wind to catch, that the earth itself offers the best insulation. She stopped at the base of the colossal structure, placing a hand on its cold, curved wall. The metal vibrated with a low hum, a song only she could hear. A stray dog with ribs like a washboard and cautious eyes watched her from a distance, its head cocked. She did not approach it, but she saw in its solitude a reflection of her own. Here she would make her stand. Not in defiance, but in observance of a deeper law. She began her work not with a hammer and nails, but with her hands and the earth itself. The town watched her, a distant curiosity that soon curdled into suspicion and then outright mockery. Her mission was an absurdity to them, the folly of a desperate girl clinging to a ruin. The first task was cleaning. Decades of neglect had filled the silo's base with debris, dirt, and the nesting material of countless small creatures. For weeks, she hauled it all out, her face and clothes perpetually smudged with grime, her muscles aching with a satisfying fire. She worked from dawn until the last light failed, fueled by a purpose that baffled all who saw her. Sheriff Miller rode out one afternoon, a man whose authority rested on the unshakable foundation of convention. He was not unkind, but his gaze held the weary impatience of someone dealing with the irrational. He reined in his horse, looking down at her from a height that was both physical and social. "Miss," he began, his voice flat, "you can't live here. This is abandoned property." "It isn't safe." Annabeth paused, leaning on her shovel, and looked up at him. Her face was streaked with dirt, but her eyes were clear. "It will be," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm making it safe." For the sheriff sighed, gesturing vaguely at the towering metal shell. "This is a grain silo, not a house. A winter storm will peel it open like a can." It was a statement of fact, an inarguable truth in his world. But Annabeth's world operated on different truths. "Its bones are strong," she answered, patting the curved wall. "It just needs a warmer skin." Her grandfather had shown her drawings, diagrams scratched into slate, of ancient roundhouses that had stood for 1,000 years. He spoke of how a thick layer of daub, a mixture of clay, straw, and water, could turn a thin wall into a thermal fortress, storing the sun's heat and repelling the bitter cold. She had already found the perfect clay deposit down by the creek bed. She had a lifetime supply of dry prairie grass for straw. She had everything she needed. The sheriff saw only a girl playing in the mud. "There's a room for you at the boarding house until the circuit judge comes through," he offered, a final attempt at reason. "We'll find you a place." A respectable 1 inch. Annabeth simply shook her head. "Thank you, Sheriff." "But my place is here." He stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head slowly, a man defeated by a logic he could not comprehend. He turned his horse and rode away, leaving her alone with her impossible dream and the silent, watchful dog who had crept a little closer. The ridicule started as a murmur in the general store and grew into a common joke told over lukewarm ale in the saloon. They called her the Silo Girl, a name spoken with a mixture of pity and contempt. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose influence was woven through the town's social fabric like a tight, unforgiving stitch, was the primary architect of Annabeth's reputation. "She's addled," Mrs. Gable would declare, her voice carrying across the store's dusty floorboards. "Living in a rusty can, mixing mud pies like a child." "It's a disgrace," the other women would nod in agreement, their faces arranged in masks of solemn concern that barely hid their satisfaction. A shared object of scorn was a powerful community glue. Annabeth heard the whispers when she went to town for supplies, the only time she left her work. She felt the stares on her back, saw the quick, dismissive glances. She bought flour, salt, and beans, paying with the few coins her mother had pressed into her hand in a moment of secret defiance. Each transaction was cold, perfunctory. No pleasantries were exchanged. No one asked her name. She was an outcast, a ghost haunting the edge of their world. A young man named Henry, full of the casual cruelty of youth, took the mockery a step further. He and his friends would sometimes ride out to her silo, watching her from a safe distance as she hauled buckets of clay or trod straw into the mud with her bare feet. "Building a nest, little bird," he shouted one afternoon, his laughter echoing across the plains. "The crows will have it by winter." Annabeth never responded. She simply continued her work, her movements rhythmic and focused. Her silence was more unnerving to them than any angry retort would have been. It was a wall as impenetrable as the one she was building. Inside the silo, a transformation was taking place. The inner metal wall was slowly being covered by a thick, sculpted layer of earth and plaster. It was arduous, back-breaking work, applying the heavy daub in sections, smoothing it with her hands until it was seamless. The acoustics of the space changed. The hollow echo was gone, replaced by a dense, comforting quiet. The air itself felt different, holding a cool, earthy scent. During this time, the stray dog finally closed the distance between them. He appeared one evening, a shadow at the edge of her firelight, and laid his head on his paws. Annabeth said nothing, but she left a small portion of her meager supper for him. From then on, he was her constant, silent companion. She named him Dust, for he had come from the earth, just like her home. He was her witness, the only creature in the world who saw not madness, but creation. As the summer's fierce heat gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn, Annabeth's isolation became absolute. The visits from Henry and his friends ceased, the novelty of her project having worn off. The town of Redemption Creek turned inward, preparing for the coming winter, and in their preparations, they forgot her. Or rather, they chose to forget her. Forgetting was easier than acknowledging the silent, industrious figure on the hill who defied their every convention. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. A sharp wind began to blow from the north, a constant, whining presence that stripped the last leaves from the cottonwood trees along the creek. Inside the silo, Annabeth worked on the heart of her home, the stove. Using flat stone she had gathered from the creek bed and her same clay mixture as mortar, she built a small, remarkably efficient stove near the center of the round room. It was based on another of her grandfather's designs, one that maximized heat radiation while using a minimal amount of fuel. She fashioned a flue that snaked up the interior wall, warming the earth and plaster as it rose, before venting through a carefully sealed opening in the roof. When she lit the first fire, the effect was immediate and profound. A deep, gentle warmth filled the space, a living presence that pushed back against the encroaching chill. The stone and the thick walls held the heat long after the flames had died down to embers. Dust, her faithful companion, moved closer to the stove, sighing with a contentment he had likely never known. The silo was no longer a metal shell, it was a sanctuary. It was a womb of earth and warmth, sealed against the world that had rejected her. She had a bed of straw and dry grass, a small cache of provisions, and a deep, abiding sense of peace. She had built not just a shelter, but a home, crafted from the very land they all stood upon. The loneliness was still there, a quiet ache in the moments before sleep, but it was overshadowed by a feeling of profound rightness. She was where she was meant to be. Her hands, calloused and strong, were proof of her purpose. She had taken the world's judgment and transformed it into a foundation. While the townspeople nailed boards over their windows and stuffed rags into the cracks in their walls, Annabeth sat by her stone stove, listening to the rising wind, feeling the steady, radiant heat on her face, and knew she was ready. There was one man in Redemption Creek who watched Annabeth not with scorn, but with a deep, ancestral curiosity. Amos was an old trapper who lived in a small cabin miles from town, a man more comfortable with the language of the sky and the seasons than with human chatter. He had seen empires rise and fall in the patterns of migrating birds and felt the turn of the ages in the ache of his bones. He had observed Annabeth's labor from afar, noting the rhythmic persistence of her work, the way she seemed to be listening to the land itself. He saw no madness in her actions, only a purpose he did not fully understand but respected nonetheless. One afternoon, as a steel-gray sky pressed down upon the prairie, he finally walked to her silo. He did not approach the door but stood near the outer wall, running a gnarled hand over the rusted metal. Annabeth emerged, wiping her clay-stained hands on a piece of burlap. They stood in silence for a moment, two solitary figures against a vast and brooding landscape. Amos pointed a thumb toward the north. "The north wind sings a different song this year," he said, his voice a low rumble like stones shifting in a riverbed. "It's an old song." A hungry 1-inch Annabeth listened, her gaze following his. She had felt it too, a change in the tenor of the wind, a sharper edge to the cold. "The geese left 2 weeks early," Amos continued, his eyes scanning the horizon. "The squirrels are burying their nuts deep." Deeper than I've ever seen. He looked at her then, his gaze direct and serious. He did not ask about her methods, about the mud and straw. He did not question her choice of home. He saw past the strangeness of it to the instinct beneath. "Whatever you're doing here," he said, nodding toward the silo, "finish it. The sky is holding its breath. And when it lets go, it will be a scream." He gave her a curt nod, a gesture of respect between two people who understood the world in a way others did not, and walked away. His words were not a warning, they were a confirmation of. They did not see it as a judge. They did not feel the world holding its breath. They were deaf to the old, hungry song of the wind, their ears filled with the noise of their own certainties. Annabeth worked with a renewed urgency, sealing the final gaps around her door, checking the flue of her stove one last time. A strange, bruised light settled over the plains that evening, a sickly yellow-purple that drained the world of its color. Then, the silence began. The constant whisper of the wind died. The birds fell quiet. It was a profound, unnatural hush, the moment of terrifying calm before the breaking of the world. The storm did not arrive, it detonated. It came not as snow, but as a solid wall of white, a horizontal blizzard driven by a wind that was no longer a sound but a physical entity. It was a malevolent force that tore and clawed at the straight lines and sharp corners of Redemption Creek. The temperature plunged with breathtaking speed, from merely cold to lethally frigid in the space of an hour. The world vanished into a screaming vortex of ice and fury. Inside the town, pride and preparation crumbled into terror. The wind found every crack in the wooden buildings, every weakness in their construction. It shrieked through the walls, sucking the warmth out with a ravenous appetite. Sheriff Miller fought to brace the door of his office as the frame groaned and splintered. The building, a symbol of order, was being torn apart by a force that knew no law. He could hear the roar of the wind as it ripped the roof from the general store across the street. This was not a winter storm. It was a reckoning. In her small house, Mrs. Gable huddled by her hearth, her smug certainty evaporating with every violent gust that shook her home to its foundations. A sudden, explosive crack echoed through the room as the main support beam in her roof gave way under the impossible pressure. A cascade of ice and snow poured into her parlor, extinguishing the fire and plunging her into a maelstrom of freezing darkness. Her world, so carefully constructed from judgment and social standing, had been breached and violated in an instant. Throughout the town, the story was the same. Structures built with arrogant confidence were dismantled by the pure, impartial physics of the storm. The right angles that defined their world became liabilities, catching the full force of the gale. The straight lines of the streets became wind tunnels, accelerating the icy onslaught. Everything they had trusted, everything they had believed to be strong and sensible, was failing them. But on the hill, inside the circle, there was calm. The wind met the curved wall of the silo and flowed around it, unable to find a purchase, its rage deflected and dissipated. The sound of the storm was a deep, muffled roar, a distant battle that could not penetrate the thick, earthen skin Annabeth had built. Inside, a single lantern cast a warm, steady glow. The stone stove radiated a profound and gentle heat. Annabeth sat on her straw bed, her hand resting on the warm fur of Dust, who slept peacefully at her feet. She was not afraid. She was listening to the screaming world outside her sanctuary, her heart filled not with triumph, but with a deep and somber quiet. She had obeyed the ancient laws. And she was safe. The silence inside her home was a stark contrast to the chaos consuming the town below, a pocket of impossible peace in the heart of a white hurricane. The first knock was faint, almost lost in the howl of the wind. Annabeth thought she had imagined it. Then it came again, more frantic this time, a desperate, rhythmic banging against her heavy door. Dust lifted his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Annabeth quieted him with a touch. No one should be out in this. No one could survive it. She shut the door, securing the bar, cutting off the raging storm once more. This time it was Sheriff Miller, his face grim, his usual air of authority stripped away, leaving only a raw and humbled man. He was supporting Mrs. Gable, who was weeping uncontrollably, her fine clothes tattered and frozen stiff. Her carefully maintained facade of social superiority had been shattered along with her home. Miller looked at Annabeth, his gaze holding a universe of unspoken apology. "Our roofs, they're gone," he said, his voice hoarse. "We saw your light, her light." A single lantern in a round room, a beacon of foolishness that had become their only star of hope. She led them in, just as she had let Henry in. She pointed them toward the stove. There was no "I told you so," there was no vindication in her eyes. There was only a quiet, solemn grace. One by one, and in small, huddled groups, the survivors of Redemption Creek staggered to the silo. They came stripped of everything but the primal instinct to live. The merchant, the blacksmith, the saloon owner, all of their earthly statuses were rendered meaningless. Inside the warm, circular space, they were all just cold, frightened people. The silo girl, the outcast they had ridiculed and dismissed, took them in without a word of reproach, her unconventional home becoming their ark. The hours bled into a day, and then another. The storm raged without end, a relentless siege upon the world. Inside the silo, a strange new community formed, born of shared catastrophe. 23 souls from Redemption Creek huddled together in the warm, circular space, their former lives a distant memory. The social hierarchy of the town had dissolved completely. Mrs. Gable, stripped of her finery and her sharp tongue, sat silently next to the blacksmith's wife, both of them wrapped in identical rough blankets provided by their host. Sheriff Miller, no longer a figure of authority, helped Annabeth distribute her meager stores of dried beans and flour, which she cooked into a thin, nourishing soup on the stone stove. The space was crowded, but it was not chaotic. A profound quiet had fallen over them, the quiet of people who have come face to face with their own fragility. They looked at Annabeth with a new and unsettling emotion, awe. They watched her move through the space with her calm, deliberate grace, tending the fire, checking on the most vulnerable, her face serene and unreadable. They were inside her creation, breathing her warm air, surviving because of the very madness they had mocked. The shame was a palpable thing in the room, thicker than the wood smoke. It was in the way they avoided her eyes, the way their voices were hushed and respectful when they had to speak to her. One evening, as the wind outside seemed to reach a new, terrifying crescendo, Sheriff Miller finally broke the silence. He looked directly at Annabeth, his face etched with exhaustion and a humility he had never before known. "We were wrong," he said, his voice clear and steady in the quiet room. It was not just his voice, it was the voice of the town. "We were fools. Blinded by our own pride, Henry, sitting near the wall, nodded his head, unable to speak, his face buried in his hands. Mrs. Gable let out a small, choked sob. It was a confession, a public reckoning in the heart of the sanctuary that should not exist. Annabeth simply looked at him, her expression unchanging. She offered no words of forgiveness, no platitudes of comfort. She did not need to. Her actions had already spoken more eloquently than any words could. Her forgiveness was in the warmth that enveloped them, in the roof that sheltered them, in the soup that sustained them. She had not built her home to prove them wrong. She had built it to survive. Their redemption was their own to find, and its first step was acknowledging the truth that was all around them. Their rigid, square world had shattered, while her gentle, resilient circle had held. The truth was warm, and it smelled of earth and wood smoke. After 4 days, the wind finally died. The silence it left behind was vast and absolute. When Annabeth unbarred the door, the world that greeted them was unrecognizable. It was a landscape sculpted by a savage artist, a world buried under colossal drifts of snow, some as high as the rooftops they had once covered. The town of Redemption Creek was gone, erased from view, its sharp angles softened and obliterated into a series of white, undulating mounds. The sun shone with a brilliant, blinding intensity on the pristine surface, a beautiful and terrible sight. The survivors emerged from the silo slowly, blinking like newborns into the bright, cold light. They stood together on the rise, a small, humble band of humans looking down at the ghost of their town. Their homes, their possessions, their entire world, lay buried beneath the snow. Everything they had built, everything they had valued, was lost. But they were alive. They turned, almost as one, to look at the silo. It stood unmarked, its rusted metal skin and earthen walls solid and unimpeachable against the white landscape. It was no longer an eyesore or a folly. It was a miracle. A monument not to failure, but to a wisdom they had been too arrogant to see. In the years that followed, Redemption Creek was rebuilt. But it was not rebuilt in the same image. The memory of the great storm was seared into the town's collective soul. The reconstruction began with a new understanding, a new respect for the power of the land and the wisdom of the circle. The first new structure built was a community hall, a large, round building of stone and earthen plaster, designed with Annabeth's guidance. New homes were constructed along similar principles, with thick, insulated walls and curved surfaces that offered no purchase to the wind. The town that rose from the snow was a town transformed, its architecture a reflection of a hard-won lesson in humility. Annabeth was never again the silo girl. She became the quiet heart of the new community, a respected elder before she was even 30. She never married, never sought a position of power. She didn't need to. Her authority was innate, earned not through words but through the silent, profound truth of her actions. Her silo remained her home, but it also became a place of pilgrimage, a touchstone for the town's identity, a constant reminder that the strongest walls are not always the ones that stand the straightest. Her legacy was not just in the buildings that dotted the landscape, but in the spirit of the people who inhabited them, a people who had learned to listen to the old songs of the wind, and to trust the quiet wisdom found on the margins. What is a home? Is it a structure of wood and nails, built to a plan dictated by custom and conformity? Is it for square walls and a roof, a box to keep the world out? Or is it something more? Is it a place of true refuge, a sanctuary built not from arrogance, but from a deep and patient understanding of the world as it is, not as we wish it to be? The people of Redemption Creek learned the answer to that question in the heart of a white hurricane. They learned that the strength of a wall is not in its rigidity, but in its ability to yield, to deflect, to flow with the forces that press against it. They learned that the most profound wisdom is often silent, residing not in the halls of power or the pulpits of certainty, but in the quiet, steady hands of those who have been cast out. Annabeth's story became a legend, a parable told to future generations. It was a story about a storm, yes, but it was about so much more. It was a story about pride and the fall that inevitably follows it. It was a story about the courage to trust a truth that no one else can see. If you were there, in that town of straight lines and narrow minds, what would you have done? Would you have joined the chorus of mockers, secure in the comfort of shared opinion? Or would you have felt the stirrings of a different kind of truth, the quiet hum of a different wisdom? We all build shelters for ourselves. We build them from our beliefs, our careers, our relationships, our certainties. We construct them to be strong, to be respectable, to stand tall against the world. But we must always ask ourselves, are our walls built to face the storm? Are they founded on unshakable truth, or on the shifting sands of public opinion? True refuge is not a place, but a state of being. It is the quiet center that holds when the world screams. It is the unshakable conviction that allows one to stand alone, to mix the clay and the straw, to build a circle in a world of squares, trusting not in the applause of the crowd, but in the deep, resonant wisdom of the earth itself. Annabeth knew this. She did not set out to save a town. She set out only to save herself, by building a home that was true. And in doing so, she created a refuge for all.